In 1934, as the shadow of Nazi Germany began to stretch across the European continent, a quiet panic was taking hold within the British government. Its generals, men who had seen the mechanized slaughter of the Great War, understood that the next conflict would be decided not in the mud of the trenches, but in the skies above, and Britain, an island nation, was a naked and vulnerable target for the bomber aircraft that were now rolling off German production lines with chilling efficiency. They looked to science not for understanding, but for a miracle. They desperately sought a wonder weapon, a death ray straight from the pages of science fiction, something capable of smiting enemy aircraft from the sky with an invisible bolt of energy. Instead, a quiet, unassuming Scottish meteorologist, a man who spent his days studying the physics of thunderstorms, came forward with an idea that most of the military establishment considered equally fanciful, not a proposal to destroy aeroplanes with radio waves, but to see them, to detect them from miles away, through the black of night and the thickest of cloud. The Air Ministry was profoundly skeptical. The experts declared it impractical, a theoretical curiosity with no real-world application. But Robert Watson Watt was about to construct the secret weapon that would, in Britain's darkest hour, save it from invasion. This is the story of the man whose invisible vision changed the course of the Second World War. Robert Alexander Watson Watt was born in 1892 in Brecon, Scotland. He was a direct descendant, it was said, of James Watt, the celebrated engineer whose improvements to the steam engine had powered the Industrial Revolution. Ingenuity, it seemed, was in his blood. But Robert's fascination was not with the tangible world of gears and pistons and steam, but with the unseen forces that filled the air around him. Radio waves. He was not a military man, nor a weapons designer by trade. He was a pure scientist, the superintendent of a small radio research station whose primary focus was meteorology. To him, radio waves were not instruments of war, they were instruments of understanding. His days were spent devising and perfecting methods of using radio to track the approach of thunderstorms, listening to the crackle of static they generated and triangulating their position. He saw radio as a magnificent puzzle of applied physics, a force of nature to be harnessed and comprehended. While other military engineers were thinking in terms of larger shells, faster aircraft, and thicker armor, Robert Watson Watt was thinking in terms of wavelengths, frequencies, and reflections. His world was one of sine waves and cathode ray tubes. In 1934, the Air Ministry's Directorate of Scientific Research, in its desperate search for a defense against bombers, put out a quiet but urgent inquiry. A substantial prize was offered to anyone who could construct a functional death ray capable of injuring a pilot or detonating a bomb load from a distance. The question inevitably landed on Watson Watt's desk. He was, after all, the government's foremost civilian expert on radio. He discussed the problem with his assistant, a brilliant young scientist named Arnold Wilkins. Together they ran the calculations. The sheer amount of energy required to do any meaningful damage to an aircraft from miles away was simply colossal, far beyond anything the technology of the era could hope to generate. It was, they concluded, a physical impossibility. He drafted a formal memorandum back to the ministry, politely and methodically explaining precisely why their desired death ray could not be built. But then, as he was finishing the document, a thought occurred to him, an addendum, a footnote to a failed idea that would alter the fate of nations. He wrote, "Meanwhile, attention is being turned to the still difficult, but less unpromising problem of radio detection and the possibility of locating the aircraft by the reception of its reflected wireless waves. The energy needed to detect an aeroplane, he reasoned, was millions upon millions of times less than the energy needed to destroy it. What if, instead of trying to strike the aircraft down, they simply illuminated it with a flood of radio energy and listened for the faint echo that bounced back?" The concept was, in its essence, brilliantly simple, but in practice, it was an undertaking of immense complexity. It was a moment of pure scientific insight, born not from a military brief to create a weapon, but from the intellectual exercise of demolishing a fantasy. Robert knew he was onto something profound. He did not yet know that this quiet, scientific postscript, written in a dusty government office, was the very first stone being laid in the fortress that would defend Britain in the war to come. The ministry's reception of Watson Watt's memorandum was a mixture of disappointment and grudging curiosity. They had asked for a thunderbolt, and had been offered a looking-glass. The dream of a death ray, a weapon that could win a war before it had truly begun, was a seductive one. Detection felt passive, defensive, a far less glorious solution. Yet the logic in Watson-Watt's calculations was undeniable, and more importantly, they had absolutely no other credible proposals on the table. With a palpable sense of clutching at straws, they approved a minuscule grant, barely enough to cover the most basic of expenses, for Watson-Watt to prove his outlandish concept. He was given one chance, and one chance only, to show that his theory was more than just elegant mathematics on a page. The fate of the entire project, and perhaps the future of Britain's air defense, rested on a single decisive demonstration. For weeks, Watson-Watt and Arnold Wilkins worked with a feverish intensity. They had no time and no budget to build a dedicated high-power transmitter. Instead, they devised an ingenious, if somewhat audacious plan. They would piggyback on the existing infrastructure of the British Broadcasting Corporation. The BBC's powerful shortwave radio transmitter at Daventry in Northamptonshire broadcast its programs to the Empire. For a few precious hours, this voice of Britain would become their illuminator. Their own equipment was a collection of wires, valves, and antennae, cobbled together and mounted in the back of a nondescript commercial van. This was not a gleaming military laboratory. It was science at its most raw and improvised. The receiver was connected to a cathode ray oscilloscope, a device that would trace a green, ghostly line across a small circular screen. This screen was the altar upon which their theory would be proven or sacrificed. The day chosen for the experiment was the 26th of February, 1935. It was a cold, typically damp English day. The van was parked in a field, its simple receiving aerial pointed towards the sky. The key observer from the Air Ministry, a man named H.E. Wimperis, joined them, his expression a mask of professional skepticism. Miles away, a Royal Air Force Handley Page Hayford, a lumbering twin-engine bomber, took off, its crew unaware that they were about to become the first aircraft in history to be tracked by what the world would later call radar. The plan was precise. The bomber would fly a predetermined course that would take it directly through the main beam of the BBC's broadcast. If Watson-Watt was right, the metal airframe of the bomber would act like a mirror, reflecting a tiny fraction of that radio energy back towards their van. On their screen, they hoped to see a small disturbance, a flicker in the steady green line. They waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Inside the cramped, cold van, the only sounds were the low hum of the electronics and the quiet, focused breathing of the men inside. They stared intently at the oscilloscope screen. The green line held steady. Was the equipment working? Had they made a fundamental error in their calculations? Doubt began to creep into the cold air. Then, Wimperis checked his watch and announced that the aircraft should be entering the beam. Eyes were glued to the screen, and then it happened. A tiny pulse of light, a small, almost imperceptible blip appeared on the screen, causing the green line to jump. It held for a moment, then vanished. It appeared again, stronger this time, a clear and unambiguous signal. It was the ghost of an aeroplane, a phantom painted with radio waves. The Hayford bomber flying unseen 8 miles away had been detected. A quiet sense of elation filled the van. It had worked. In that cold, damp field, they had just witnessed the birth of a new age. They had proven, beyond any doubt, that it was possible to see the invisible. Robert knew he had created something special, but he did not yet know that that tiny flicker of light would become the first sentinel in the most sophisticated air defense system the world had ever seen. The race against time had just begun. The successful demonstration in the Northamptonshire field acted like a powerful electric shock to the corridors of the Air Ministry. Skepticism did not so much fade as it was violently supplanted by a sense of breathtaking urgency. The abstract threat of aerial bombardment suddenly had a potential, tangible counter. The question was no longer if Watson-Watt's concept could work, but how fast it could be transformed from a makeshift experiment in a van into a fully operational, nationwide shield. A war with Germany was no longer a distant possibility. With each passing month, it felt more like an impending certainty. Britain was in a race, not for arms, but for perception. Robert Watson-Watt and his small, dedicated team were plunged into a project of almost unimaginable scale and complexity. To build a single radar station was a significant undertaking. To build a chain of them, stretching from the northern tip of Scotland down to the southern coast of England, was a Herculean feat of engineering. The first challenge was power and precision. The BBC transmitter had been a clever expedient, but it was a blunt instrument, broadcasting a continuous wave of energy. To be truly effective, the system needed to know not just that an aircraft was present, but precisely where it was. It needed to measure range. The solution, which Watson-Watt's team developed with incredible speed, was to abandon the continuous wave and embrace the pulse. They would send out short, incredibly powerful bursts of radio energy, each lasting just a few millionths of a second, and then listen in the silent interval that followed. The time it took for an echo to return, traveling at the speed of light, could be measured. And if you could measure the time, you could calculate the distance with astonishing accuracy. This leap from simple detection to precise range-finding was the critical breakthrough that transformed radar from a scientific curiosity into a deadly military weapon. The landscape of Britain's eastern and southern coastlines began to change. Strange alien structures started to rise from the quiet fields and clifftops. Skeletons of steel, 110 meters high, were erected to transmit the powerful pulses. Nearby, a second set of wooden towers, 73 meters tall, were built to hold the receiving antenna, their timber construction chosen to avoid interfering with the faint incoming signals. To the local population, these gargantuan structures were a source of mystery and rumor. Were they for a new form of radio broadcast? Some kind of death ray after all? Few could have guessed that they were the watchtowers of a new, invisible frontier. But building the towers was only the beginning. The real genius of the system, which was officially codenamed Chain Home, lay not in the individual stations, but in their integration into a single, cohesive network. Information was not enough. It needed to be understood, collated, and acted upon in seconds. This gave birth to an entirely new kind of military facility, the filter room. Deep within fortified underground bunkers, far from the coastal stations, was the nerve center of the entire system. Here, in rooms buzzing with the quiet intensity of a library during finals, the raw data from the radar stations was fed. Operators, many of them young women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or WAF, sat before large plotting tables, which were massive maps of the British Isles and the English Channel. Receiving information via telephone headsets, they would place and move wooden blocks representing enemy aircraft formations. It was a ghostly ballet of information, translating invisible radio echoes into a clear, visual representation of an impending attack. Their calm, precise work under immense pressure formed the human heart of this vast electronic machine. From these filter rooms, a clear, filtered picture of the air situation was passed up the chain of command to RAF Fighter Command's headquarters. For the first time in the history of warfare, a general could look at a map and see, in real time, exactly where the enemy was, how many of them there were, and where they were going. Long before the first air raid siren had begun to wail, all of this was accomplished under a thick blanket of secrecy and against a relentlessly ticking clock. Watson Watt drove his team with a tireless energy born of scientific passion and patriotic duty. Each failure was not a setback, but a data point. Each problem was not an obstacle, but a puzzle to be solved. He adjusted frequencies, redesigned antennae, and refined the complex oscilloscopes that served as the operator's eyes. While Hitler's engineers were perfecting the Messerschmitts and Heinkels that would soon darken Europe's skies, Watt's engineers were perfecting the system that would be waiting to meet them. By the summer of 1939, the chain was largely complete. The towers stood silent sentinel along the coast. The filter rooms were manned. The system was online, but its ultimate test was yet to come. Would it hold up under the strain of real combat, against the full fury of the most powerful air force the world had ever seen? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. In the summer of 1940, the storm broke. France had fallen in a matter of weeks. Its armies shattered by the German blitzkrieg. The British Expeditionary Force had been miraculously evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, but they had left behind almost all of their heavy equipment. Britain stood alone, a defiant island fortress braced for the inevitable assault. From airfields across occupied France and Belgium, Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe began to assemble its might. The plan was brutally simple: to launch a massive aerial offensive codenamed Adlerangriff, or Eagle Attack, that would obliterate the Royal Air Force, both in the air and on the ground. Once air supremacy was achieved, the path would be clear for Operation Sea Lion, the full-scale invasion of Britain. On paper, the odds were terrifyingly long. The Luftwaffe had more aircraft, more experienced pilots seasoned by combat in Spain and Poland, and a fearsome reputation for invincibility. The RAF was outnumbered, its pilots were young and largely untested, and its precious airfields were within easy striking distance. But Britain possessed a single, decisive advantage that the German High Command did not, and could not, fully comprehend. They had Chain Home. As the first waves of German bombers and their fighter escorts lifted off from French soil and began their climb over the English Channel, they flew in the confident expectation of achieving surprise. But there was no surprise. Miles away, in the darkened, hushed rooms of Britain's coastal radar stations, their approach was already being painted in flickers of green light. On the oscilloscopes, the operators watched as the individual blips coalesced into larger and larger masses. They were seeing the enemy assemble his forces in real time. The information, stripped of ambiguity and translated into cold, hard facts, began to flow. Over the telephone lines, the calm, measured voices of the WAF operators relayed the plots to the filter rooms. Hostile 70+, track 24 Alpha, Angels 15, heading northwest towards Dover. The message was clear, precise, and devastatingly effective. In the underground bunkers of Fighter Command, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding and his sector commanders watched as the wooden blocks representing the Luftwaffe formations were pushed across the vast plotting tables. They could see the size of the raid, its altitude, its speed, and its intended target. They were not fighting blind. They were fighting with a god's eye view of the battlefield. This knowledge was revolutionary. It completely upended the calculus of air combat. Without radar, the RAF would have been forced to fly constant, exhausting standing patrols, sending up squadrons to circle endlessly, in the hope of being in the right place at the right time. Fuel would be wasted, engines would be worn out, and pilots would be fatigued before they ever saw an enemy. It was a strategy for a war of attrition that Britain simply could not win. But with Chain home, the strategy was transformed into one of lethal economy. The Spitfires and Hurricanes could wait on the ground, engines silent, pilots ready. Only when the size, location, and altitude of a specific raid were known would the order to scramble be given. The young men of the RAF, many still in their late teens or early 20s, would race to their aircraft and climb into the sky, not on a hopeful search, but with a precise mission. They were vectored by ground controllers, who, watching the same radar picture, could guide them onto the perfect interception course. Vector 120, climb to Angels 20, bandits 50 miles ahead, slightly to your port. The German pilots, flying high above the clouds, were repeatedly stunned. No matter how they varied their approach, no matter the time of day, it seemed the British fighters were always there, waiting for them, often positioned perfectly with the sun at their backs. It was an uncanny, almost supernatural ability to anticipate their every move. One captured German pilot, when interrogated, expressed the pervasive sense of frustration and bewilderment that gripped the Luftwaffe. "It is most frustrating. It is as if you know every single one of our intentions." They didn't know the Germans' intentions. They just knew, with unerring accuracy, where they were. Chainhome itself did not shoot down a single German aircraft. It was not a weapon in that sense. It was an enabler. It was a force multiplier. It allowed the brave and skilled pilots of the RAF to be deployed with a ruthless efficiency that completely negated the Luftwaffe's numerical superiority. By ensuring that every sortie was targeted, by conserving precious fuel and invaluable pilots, the system that Robert Watson Watt had conceived allowed a numerically inferior force to fight and win against a much larger one. By the end of September 1940, Göring's Luftwaffe had suffered unsustainable losses in both aircraft and, more critically, experienced aircrew. Hitler, frustrated by the lack of air supremacy, indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion. The Battle of Britain was won, the invasion had been averted, and the nation was safe, protected by an invisible shield of radio waves. The AIACTORYA in the Battle of Britain was a profound turning point, not just for the war, but for the very nature of warfare itself. The crucial role played by Chainhome solidified radar's importance in the minds of military planners around the globe. Robert Watson Watt's invention was no longer a secret weapon or a national curiosity. It had proven itself to be the new global standard for air defense, an indispensable tool for any modern military. The lessons learned in the skies over Kent and Sussex were rapidly disseminated. The technology, once a closely guarded British secret, was now shared with its most vital ally, the United States, as part of a broad technological exchange. This transfer of knowledge would prove instrumental, sparking a furious period of innovation in American laboratories, most notably at the MIT Radiation Laboratory. There, British theories were combined with American industrial might to produce new, more advanced, and more compact radar systems. These second-generation radars, operating on much shorter microwave frequencies, would become crucial in every theater of the war. They were small enough to be fitted into the noses of night fighter aircraft, allowing pilots to hunt their prey in total darkness. They were mounted on ships, providing early warning of approaching aircraft and enemy fleets, transforming the dynamics of naval combat, particularly in the vast expanses of the Pacific. They were even used in bombers, creating crude maps of the ground below through thick cloud cover, enabling a new level of bombing accuracy. The fundamental principle that Watson Watt had proven in that muddy field in 1935, using radio echoes to detect distant objects, was now being adapted and refined for 1,000 different applications. Robert Watson Watt, the quiet meteorologist, found himself hailed as a national hero. He was knighted by the king and showered with honors and awards from a grateful nation. He was the man whose scientific vision had saved the realm. Yet, he remained at his core a scientist, more comfortable in a laboratory than in the limelight. He never sought the fame that was thrust upon him, often deflecting praise to the dedicated team of engineers and operators who had turned his concept into a reality. For him, the true reward was not the public adulation, but the intellectual satisfaction of having solved a profoundly difficult problem, a solution that had just happened to have world-altering consequences. His legacy, however, extends far beyond the battlefield. The immense wartime investment in radar technology created a cascade of scientific and engineering breakthroughs that would shape the post-war world in ways no one could have anticipated. The development of high-power microwave transmitters, a key component of advanced radar, led directly to the invention of the microwave oven. The need for precise timing circuits in radar receivers accelerated the development of digital electronics. The cathode ray tubes that displayed the blips became the direct ancestors of television screens and computer monitors. In a very real sense, the entire digital age has its roots in the frantic, secret work carried out by Watson Watt and his contemporaries. There is a beautiful and poetic irony to his story. He was a fundamentally peaceful man, a scientist who had dedicated his life to understanding the weather. Yet his most influential creation was an instrument of war. The government had come to him asking for a weapon of destruction, a death ray. Instead, he gave them an instrument of perception. He did not provide Britain with a sharper sword, but with eyes that could see for 100 miles, through cloud and in the dead of night. He gave them the gift of foresight. The modest Scottish scientist who had transformed the study of thunderstorms into the salvation of a nation never saw himself as a warrior. To him, it was simply his work, identifying a problem, formulating a hypothesis, and engineering a solution. But that work, born of intellectual curiosity, ensured that Britain survived its most perilous hour to fight another day. More than 80 years later, his true legacy is not etched in stone monuments, but is written invisibly in the safe skies above us, a constant, silent testament to the man who taught a nation to see in the dark. The end of the Second World War did not diminish the importance of radar. It merely changed its application. The vast global network of radar installations, built for war, was repurposed for peace. The very same principles that had guided Spitfires to intercept Heinkels were now used to guide civilian airliners safely through crowded skies. The air traffic control systems that are the invisible bedrock of modern global travel are the direct descendants of Chain Home. Every time we board an aeroplane, we are placing our trust in a system whose fundamental DNA was written by Watson Watt and his team in the 1930s. The ability to see aircraft, regardless of weather or time of day, transformed aviation from a daring adventure into a routine, reliable form of mass transportation. Furthermore, his original passion, meteorology, was itself revolutionized by his invention. Weather radar, capable of detecting the size, speed, and direction of storms by bouncing radio waves off raindrops and ice crystals, became an essential tool for forecasting. The blips, that once signified enemy bombers, now signify approaching rain, giving communities vital warning of floods, hurricanes, and tornadoes. The meteorologist who put aside his study of storms to help win a war had, in the end, created the most powerful storm tracking tool in history. His work had come full circle. Watson Watt's life after the war was one of continued scientific work and consultation, though he never again worked on a project of such monumental significance. He was a man defined by a single, brilliant moment of insight that had cascaded into a world-changing technology. He had seen what others had not, that the real power of radio was not in its capacity to transmit a voice or a weaponized bolt of energy, but in its ability to listen to the silent echoes of the world. It was a paradigm shift. He taught us that information about the enemy's position was more valuable than a more powerful gun. This philosophy, that situational awareness is the key to victory, has become a central tenet of modern military doctrine. Today's battlefields are dominated by drones, satellites, and networked sensors, all of which are, in essence, the conceptual children of Chain Home, all striving to provide that same God's eye view that Hugh Dowding had in his bunker in 1940. To understand Robert Watson Watt is to understand the nature of true innovation. It rarely comes from a direct linear pursuit of a stated goal. The Air Ministry asked for a death ray. If Watson Watt had confined his thinking to that single, impossible task, he would have failed. Instead, he allowed his mind to wander, to make a lateral connection between the physics of radio reflection and the tactical problem of air defense. His breakthrough was not an invention in the traditional sense, but a profound reimagining of the question itself. He turned a problem of destruction into a problem of perception. He also embodied the crucial, and often overlooked, virtue of pragmatism. Chain home was, by the standards of later radar systems, a crude and cumbersome beast. It operated on long wavelengths. Its towers were immense and immobile, and its accuracy was limited. But it was what could be built, quickly and reliably with the technology available in the mid-1930s. A more perfect system that existed only on paper in 1940 would have been useless. Watson Watt understood that the best weapon is the one you actually have on the day of the battle. He chose functionality over elegance, and in doing so, he gave the RAF the tool they needed, just in time. The quiet, unassuming scientist who had transformed a meteorological curiosity into the shield of a nation remains one of the pivotal, yet often unsung, figures of the 20th century. His legacy continues to echo, silently and invisibly, all around us. He was the man who defeated the bomber, not with a bang, but with a blip.